Hello, this is SOC 4420 Week 11. The group members for this presentation are Chris Jackson, Macy Nilsson, Casey Priest, and Eduardo Valles. Our subject matter is no for-profit corporations should not run or be allowed to run U.S. prisons. What are private prisons? According to Sean Bryant, in the business model of private prisons or for-profit prisons are prisons that the government has contracted out to corporations. The function of these prisons is so that government doesn't have to run as many prisons, and this industry is like every other where the government deals with contracted out work. Some of the concerns about this are that, corporations are for profit, so they may not be in the best interest of the inmates and justice. We will discuss multiple reasons why throughout this presentation. We will also go over rebuttals and then finally our conclusion. Public versus private prisons. First off, with public prisons. Here are some bullets about that. So first, they have to report inmate data, staffing, and where the money was spent. They're ran by the government. They're nonprofit because they receive money from the government. So sentence length, number of inmates, all of that does not matter. They cannot pick and choose who they house. And so this is a government-run program for the protection of the United States. They are focused on maintaining order and justice, and they're using taxpayer dollars to do this. They're not making a profit. Everyone that's hired there, it's under the regular salaries and no bonuses for amounts of people that are in the prisons or anything like that. It's strictly a government-run program, which there's tens of thousands or if not millions of people in the United States that are working for the government. And as most people know, they make a fairly humble salary, and it doesn't really matter what they do. They're pretty much paid what they're paid. However, on the private sector, very few prisons do report inmate data, staffing, or where the money was spent. They're ran by private corporations, which means they don't have to be showing all of their the inner workings of their business. The more inmates, the longer the sentence, the more money the private prisons make, and they can pick and choose who they house. More private prisons will not house those with mental illness or physical illness that make it more expensive to house. So, in this particular type of prison, there is a lot of risk for bonuses paid out, extra dividend checks going out to these board of directors, sitting on these prisons that are looking at profit margins and how they can essentially they can make the most money from the prisoners they bring in, which is why they're not bringing in maybe people that they need to that really are in dire need, such as people with mental illness, other physical illnesses, but they're just looking at the money. So they're not even really helping the community as much as they could. And they're essentially taking the easiest people to just manage inside this prison. One thing I'd like to just add as a side note, as I was going through some of the topics that we're covering today, it made me think of more of a Hollywood style Hunger Games, where lots of people are sent out to fight, and it's something that is done and aired on the screen for public revenue, just like a football game. And so private prisons, I mean, if they're allowed to do whatever they want to do, essentially they could have these very unethical ways of making money off of people that are in the prison system. So obviously that's an extreme example, but private prisons could essentially do just about anything they want within the walls of the confines of their prison. And so it does take not only a lot of risk of corruption, however, there's also a risk of breaching people's human rights and their constitutional rights. Here's an interesting statistic. Carolyn Marco with Frontiers.org says that inmates that are released from private prisons have a 22% higher chance at reoffending than those that are from public prisons. Another important thing to consider is the function of prisons. Professor Van Giem states that the function of prisons is to get retribution, deter the person from committing the crime, incapacitate the criminal, or to rehabilitate. It does not seem that the private prisons are functioning correctly because prisoners from private prisons have a 22% higher chance of reoffending than those coming from public prisons. Therefore, their focus, as I discussed earlier, is more on making money than actually bringing prisoners back into working society. Private prisons in America require states to keep at least 90% of prison beds filled or pay a penalty to the private for-profit corporations. So this is another reason that shows why private prisons in America doesn't have a goal to reform people. They just have a goal to keep those people in prison. Arizona Department of Corrections had to pay management and training corporations almost $10 million because they didn't meet the bed quota in 2011. Most private prisons have a bed quota, meaning that a certain percentage of beds must be filled, otherwise the state will have to pay a fee. This was already discussed earlier. This is one of those instances. For example, citizens' tax dollars were used because they weren't enough get enough revenue from the inmates. Therefore, us, the American people, have to pay a corporation who's also making money. So in all senses, it's just creating this this system where corruption is very likely to occur. Here's a case study with a gentleman named Nestor Garay. He was imprisoned as an inmate in a private prison in Texas. His cellmates were woken up to Nestor's pain groans at 1:30 in the morning on June 26. His cellmates called the guard, who in turn called the only nurse on duty. It was a licensed vocational nurse, and the LVN found Nestor in his own urine and unresponsive. So he called a physician's assistant, and the PA told him to give Nestor some seizure medication. The morning nurse found Nestor on the floor in his cell at 6:15 a.m. and sent him to the ER almost 5 hours after Nestor's cellmates had called for help. At a nearby hospital, it was found that Nestor was having a stroke, and neurologists said that treatment would not help after 5 hours had passed since the stroke. So unfortunately, there's many cases like this where people who are in these prison systems are mistreated either medically or just through living conditions, and they are not receiving the standard of care that is seen in public prisons. So just to address this further, the lack of medical care, so according to this nurse journal, LPNs and RNs are vastly different. So the LPN, or licensed practical nurse, takes orders from the registered nurse, and the LPNs cannot triage or make health assessments. The prison that Nestor was at should have had an RN on duty, but they didn't, and so they didn't send him to the ER when they should have, and essentially it caused him to have permanent brain damage. Didn't say if he died or not, but he potentially could have from that. And there's a lot of people that, whether they die or you're brain damaged, I think, to be honest, for most people, they'd rather die. According to Pueblo Rose and Alex Cazanas, attacks on correctional officers are 163% higher, and the inmate attacks are 30% higher in private prisons than public. Just another statistic why private prisons are not the preferable choice. Now, correctional officers in private prisons. Various employees who used to work in private prisons who now work at public prisons have outspoken about the problems in these private prisons. On private prisons, one private prison did not issue pepper spray or safety vests. The radios also did not work in most of their cells. These are all vital things to keep the officers safe. In the public prisons, they had working radios, vests, and pepper spray. Public prison officers make more than private officers. That's interesting, right? So actually my point earlier about bonuses, that was more specifically to higher corporate positions. Those on the lower end, it's kind of the trickle down effect of corporations where they only pay their bottom line what is necessary so that they can retain more profit margin for those that own the company, the private company, right? Those the investors, the private investors and the C-suite executives that run the overarching facility. So it's interesting. This is just like any other, maybe not to say the word corrupt, but any greedy corporation out there that you could say is not in the best interest of their people. There's a lot of companies that are, but it seems like just based on these statistics and some of this insider information that the private prison system is not. And it's not a surprise. This isn't a type of business that is super honorable in its focus. Obviously, they're seeing about a dollar sign associated with all of these prisoners. So not only is it about 20% less, but officers in these prisons don't have enough officers, so they're stretched thin, and that's also, like I said, to minimize overhead, right? If they have to pay them less, it's more money for the investors. So lack of sufficient prisoner space. More than likely, there will be no separation in private prisons to different classes of crime. So if you have someone that went in there for fraud, they're in there with a serial killer, rapist, all the gamut. Obviously, that can create some issues. People that are violent offenders or multiple time offenders, it's going to cause a lot of conflicts. They're going to really roll over a lot of those other people that are maybe a little more pacifists in a lot of other ways with regards to crime. For example, some prisons don't even separate, like I just said, those who murdered who created taxes. So tax fraud, maybe white collar person that maybe they haven't ever done anything violent, but they did some shady dealings in their business practices. Those two individuals shouldn't be together because it causes more opportunities for violent crimes within the prison system. By having a greater inmate to guard ratio, it makes it more likely for inmates to fight each other as well, or gang up and fight a guard. So, because there's less guards and there's more inmates, and there are a whole bunch of them moshed together, probably in smaller quarters as well, because they want to save money. It's like a cat, not to be too descriptive, but it's like farming, right? If you had a cattle farm. They're just in corrals, and that's because they don't have the focus that a government institution that's really focused on reintegrating them into society wants to give them help with their mental health and with just overall living. Now, there is something that we discussed earlier in this semester, or just recently actually, about how you don't want the inmates to have a better living than those that are on the street, or maybe not on the streets, but specifically those that are in the poorer communities. So it is a fine line for sure. But that being said, you don't want it to be inhumane at the same time, which these private prisons could potentially be. So here's some rebuttals. So cost effective. You could say private prisons have an emphasis on cost effectiveness over government prisons, and so cost of inmate per day is less than it comes to with public prisons. So, for example, private corporations or corrections were paid an average of almost $13 less a year. This disparity left private prisons with a turnover rate of 43%. So private prisons make up for the difference in fees for inmates being housed in private prisons. This is typically in the halfway house and lower security facilities. For example, the work release facility in Weber County charges the offenders a daily rate to be in work release program. This fee includes food, medical, and drug testing, where private prisons add fees for the cost of drug screening and other items. So some counter rebuttals to the cost savings is those in favor of private prisons feel that it is due to the budget constraints. The federal government or federal prison systems and private prisons can provide better safety for these offenders and officers. Training private sector undergo on average 174 hours of pre-service training, though, compared to corrections officers with 232 hours of pre-service training. So they're less trained and they have a higher turnover rate, which, when you're talking about business even, technically higher turnover typically does cost more money. So it's kind of a catch-22 there. A survey done shows that private sector has on average 40 assaults on inmates a year compared to the public sector of 19 per year. In summary, so private prisons aren't beneficial and don't treat inmates with the care that is required. It is almost always a very unsafe environment since there's a lack of guards and supervision. The individuals who are in serving time in private prisons are treated bad, and guards have less training than those in the regular sanctions, as well as higher than average turnover rate as results to the danger and inconsistency. And as I discussed earlier, they get paid less, and typically when people get paid less and working conditions are not well, that's what causes turnover. So it's perpetuating a bad environment, and it is just lining the pockets of board of directors and CEOs of companies, and the people that usually invest in these kind of companies are not necessarily, I don't want to generalize, but I would say if you were someone who had money in your pocket and you wanted to invest it in a noble cause, maybe some people would consider a noble cause, but I don't think under the current circumstances of what private prisons are doing, that it is actually making a difference, possibly, especially with all the statistics. So unless somebody comes to the table who wants to greatly basically completely reinnovate the private sector of prison system under the current conditions, it is highly discouraged that this would be the favorable choice. Here are references for this presentation, and with that, thank you for your time. Again, this is Social 4420, Week 11, and group members Chris Jackson, Macy, Casey, and Eduardo. Thank you for your time.